Hallo? Ja, det var høj. Hej, jeg hedder Kim Gud, og jeg arbejder her i AVS Nordic. Og jeg vil gerne byde jer velkommen til vores Alister Chapman arrangement her. Nogle har måske været til et tidligere arrangement, vi har holdt for et års tid siden. Der var ret stor tilslutning i år, så vi har valgt at holde det over 2 dage, så vi kan være her. Alister vil selvfølgelig fortælle om vores nye Burano-kamera her. Vi vil høre nogle sammenligninger mellem Sonys andre kameraer, FX3, FX6 og FX9 versus Burano. Og så får vi lov at høre en del om objektiver, og specielt Sonys objektiver. Så jeg regner med, at vi bryder op klokken 11:30 til noget frokost, som vores gode ven Henrik Boserup har arrangeret for os, cirka 3 kvarter, og så kører vi videre derfra. Så velkommen endnu en gang, og så giver jeg ordet til dig, Alister.
Good morning. Thank you. So today I'm going to be looking at Burano and Sony Cinema Line cameras. I've got lots and lots of PowerPoint slides to go through, but I will try not to bore you to death with PowerPoint. What I will say is, always when I do these sessions, they generally tend to be a lot more interesting for everybody if people ask questions. So your questions will guide what I talk about. So I've probably got 10,000 PowerPoint slides, and I really could bore you to death with those. But if you ask questions, then I understand better what it is you'd like to know about, or what it is that you're more interested in, and I can guide my presentation based on that. And generally, it's far, far more interesting when we have a discussion based on what you want to know rather than what I think you should know. So do ask those questions at any point. Don't wait till the end. I really don't mind being interrupted by somebody at the back going, "Oi, I didn't understand that. What the hell are you talking about?" Because that probably means you're not the only one that didn't understand it, because I'm talking too fast, or I've missed a slide in my presentation, and I'm talking about something that I haven't given you any background on. So do ask those questions at any point. I'm going to show some videos as well as we go, and a few other things. So let's kind of get into it. So I'm a Sony ambassador. I've been a Sony ambassador or independent certified expert for around 15 years now. So I've been doing this a lot. A lot of people, it's sometimes a difficult situation, because clearly those of you that know me know that I have an amazingly good relationship with Sony, and I'm not pretending otherwise. I've used Sony cameras for my entire career. Now, that's a career that goes back to the late 1980s. I started working in film and television in 1988. Before that, I was doing videos of motorsports as a sort of a sideline business to my main work, which was developing cameras for use in outside broadcasts. So I've worked in the industry a very long time, but most of that time I've used Sony equipment. And that's simply because Sony's cameras have always done what Sony have promised they would do. And they've been reliable. I film in some really challenging and remote places. I go up to Norway. I'm going to show you some footage from Norway in the winter to film the Northern Lights, to Iceland to film volcanoes. I film hurricanes, tornadoes, and all of those things. One of the things that I used to do many, many years ago was film the World Windsurfing Tour. And while that might sound really glamorous and easy, because a lot of the time it was, you'd be sitting on a beach in somewhere like Aruba in the Caribbean or the Virgin Islands, waiting for some windsurfers to do something in the sunshine, and it was very, very nice. We were sponsored by Bacardi and Red Bull, so that was a bit of a disaster. But then sometimes you'd also have races that were long distance races, and would race across the Mediterranean from island to island in the Greek islands. And the weather could get really bad, and you'd be in a small boat and everything is getting incredibly wet. The boat's crashing around on the waves, a very unpleasant journey, and everything's soaking wet. and I'm using big Sony Betacams at that time, so you're talking of a camcorder that's about that big with a very expensive lens. That whole camera kit back then cost almost as much as my house did. My first Betacam camcorder with lens was £75,000 to buy, with the lens, batteries and all the kit, and I think my house was actually about £65,000 at that time. Obviously houses are a lot more now. That's a tough one. I have a daughter who's trying to get on the housing market and she's struggling. But cameras, houses have gone up and cameras have gone down. You can buy really wonderful cameras now, like the FX6, for €6,000-7,000, and it's the quality that we have now is incredible. But all the way from when I was doing that to what I do now, the key thing that you need as a professional camera person is reliability. Because if you go to do a shoot, especially if you're the one providing the equipment and it doesn't work, well, that's a problem. You can't wing it without the camera. You can't kind of get back and draw pictures and say, well, this is what it looked like. Is this all right? You've got to actually come back with good, usable footage. So that's why I've stayed with Sony, because generally speaking, their kit has worked in the UK for pretty much all the time I've worked in the business. Sony have been the number one choice for broadcast cameras and professional cameras. Obviously there's competition from companies like Panasonic and JVC, Grass Valley along the way, but it's almost always come back to Sony being the main player. And I don't think that's just because Sony do a great marketing job. I think it's because they actually provide the tools, the cameras, the equipment that people want and need, and tick all the right boxes. And that's not just me. I mean, there's just the industry in general. Sony do tend to be the number one. So I have this relationship that goes back a very, very long way. But does that mean that I'm always going to tell you to buy a Sony camera? No, it doesn't. There have been a couple of cameras that Sony have pushed my way and said, Alister, could you go and talk about this camera? And I've said no. And they said, well, why not? I said, well, I wouldn't buy one. And those cameras I haven't talked about. But all the cameras I do talk about, they're cameras that I would use myself day in, day out, and get great images from. And Burano is one of those. So let's see where Burano comes from. So obviously Cine Alta. Actually, just before we go that far, so who here has shot with a Venice from Sony? Only one. Wow. Okay, two. Or been on a shoot with a Venice, not necessarily shot with it. So you might have some ACs or assistants and people like that. There's another one or two. So not many of you. Let's go to the other extreme of Sony's lineup, FX30. Oh, come on, guys. The FX30 is a brilliant camera. The FX30, and I'll talk about the FX30 more later on, has to be one of the best cameras that Sony have ever actually made. And why do I say that? Well, for a start, it's less than €2,000. It's ridiculously cheap. And being a part of Sony's cinema line, it actually looks pretty much the same as a Venice, the output from it. It's staggeringly good for the money. It's one of those cameras. I've got one. So I had an FX3, great camera, FX6 as well, FX9, and then Sony bring out the FX30, and the first time I saw it, like, why the hell would I want that? It's APS-C, it's Super 35, why do I want another camera like that? And then I took one away and I played with it. It's got a 6K sensor in it, so it's oversampled. And that makes a tremendous difference to the image quality. And it's cheap. So I can put it in my camera bag or keep it in my laptop bag and take it anywhere. And if it gets stolen, it's a $2,000 camera. It's not like someone stealing a Burano or your FX9. So I take it everywhere. And the best camera that you've got is the one that you have. You can have the best camera in the world at home, but that's pointless. You're not going to get nice pictures of it at home. But because I was taking the FX30 everywhere, I was getting all this great footage of all these unexpected things and unusual things, and the footage looks really, really, really good. Anyway, more about that in a bit. So FX3, who's shot with the FX3 from Sony? There we go. Yep, brilliant little camera, really good camera from Sony, super in low light. Again, for what it costs, great images. FX6. That's where we are, FX6 and FX9. Right, so between FX6 and FX9, I think that's where clearly we have a lot of FX6 and FX9 users, and they're all great cameras in often somewhat slightly different ways. I've own an FX6 and an FX9, FX3 and FX30. I've almost got the full set. I don't yet have a Burano. So Sony's lineup, and we mustn't forget the FR7. Who's used the FR7? One or two? I'm curious. What do you use the FR7 for?
Small studio.
Small studio. Interesting. And again, okay, it's a really interesting camera. This is another one of those weird ones that Sony have that suddenly they said, hey, Alister, what do you think of this pan, tilt and zoom camera, FR7? And I looked at it and thought, I don't use pan, tilt and zoom cameras. Why are you showing me that? I don't do that. Took it away, played with it, tried it. I thought, actually, you know what? There's some interesting things I could do with this. Obviously, you've got small studio setups and remote studios, things like that. But what I started doing with it was shooting circus. So I film a lot of circus. I've got a big circus event coming up actually in June, which is the Glastonbury Festival. Who's heard of Glastonbury? Yeah, quite a few of you. So the Glastonbury Festival is a huge, what most people think is a music festival, but it's actually the Glastonbury Festival of the Contemporary Performing Arts. And a huge part of the festival is devoted to theatre, to cabaret, to circus, poetry, and other forms of art. And the circus fields are about 1.5 square kilometres in size. So it's not a small part of the event. They have 2 giant big top tents, and they bring some of the very top circus acts from around the world. And over the course of the festival, they have, over all the circus and theatre fields, about 3,000 different acts. And I go over there and I go to that and I film the circus acts. And who's heard of people that join the circus and run away and become a circus person? Yeah, as a child they join the circus and run off, and they never come do anything else but in the circus. For the week that I'm there, I kind of run away and become a circus person. And I really kind of wish I did more of it. And I do now. Actually, I film a lot of other acts and circus acts as something I do. Circus is very difficult to film because it's generally happens very quickly. It's rehearsed, but every act, every performance tends to be a little bit different. So it's very challenging. And one of the things we often need is high camera angles from high up to look down on the act. And the FR7, as it turns out, is a brilliant camera for doing that because you can place it up in the rigging of the big top. The other thing, because circus typically doesn't take place on a stage. Circus in a traditional circus will happen on the ground, on a floor level, and then the audience are raised around that. So to film it, if you stand at the front to film it, you're in everybody's way, and you're not very popular. So you can put the FR7 down at the front of a circus stage. It's only that tall, doesn't get in the way to get all sorts of different shots. And because it has the same image quality as the FX6 and the FX3, it cuts with all of these other cameras seamlessly. So it allows you to do a lot of really interesting things. So FX30, just very quickly, I'll talk about this camera a little bit more, but FX30, FX3, they're essentially the same camera bodies. They record 4K. The FX30 has a 6K APS-C, the Super 35 sensor. And then we have the FX3, which a lot of you are a lot more familiar with, that has this dual sensitivity mode that allows you to shoot at 12,800 ISO for some incredible low light performance. Half the time the camera can actually see better than I can at night. And it allows me, it's been one of my favorite cameras for shooting the northern lights and things like that. And I'll show you some of that later. And then we move on to the FX6. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these now. We'll come back to these later. Very similar to the FX3 in many regards, but now includes that built-in variable ND filter. So who here has shot with both the FX3 and the FX6? Yeah. What's the one thing that you always miss when you're shooting with your FX3 outside? The ND filter. The variable ND filter really is a bit of a game changer because, and in fact, just having an ND filter in your camera is such a game changer if you're filming outside. Swapping ND filters or using the polarizer ND filters, things like that, it's all doable, but it's a pain compared to being able to press a button on the camera and engage. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Engage. And engage the ND filter. So having that ND filter really makes a big difference. Then we have the FX9. Again, this has got the variable ND filter in it. Now with the FX9 we have interlaced recording, a lot of broadcast related features. It's 6K oversampling when you're shooting in full frame with the camera, which gives a nice small little image quality increase over just shooting at 4K with a 4K sensor. And a real workhorse for TV news and things like that. We have Gen Lock, so you can synchronize it for multiple cameras and multi-camera shoots, stuff like that. Then we have, at the top of the lineup, we have Sony's Venice 1, Venice 2 cameras. Venice 1 was a bit of a battle for Sony because Sony aren't really known as a maker of cinema cameras in the same way that Arri are. Arri have been making film cameras forever. When I first started, 1989, we were still shooting the Motorsport Studies Film World Rally Championship on 16mm film because it was portable, it was lightweight, it was pretty rugged and robust. And when you're shooting the World Rally Championship, you're often walking a couple of miles, a couple of kilometers into a forest or trying to get up a mountain for the Monte Carlo rally or something like that to get into position. And when a video camera was this big and then there was a portable recorder that was this big and it was all powered off either a small battery that only lasted about 5 minutes or a car battery, the amount of equipment that you used to have to carry was ridiculous. Whereas your little SR4 or Arri film camera was sort of that big, small battery and very, very portable. So we still used film at that point and would carry that much more easily into the remote locations. So Arri have been making film cameras, and those were Arri cameras, for a very long time, and that's what everyone knew as filmmakers. When Sony came along with their F23 camera, then the F35 and F65, it was like, hang on a minute, these aren't really film cameras, these are video cameras on steroids. They're just a fancy video camera. And I think that it took a long time for anyone to accept that you could make a feature film with a video camera. One of the very early attempts was Star Wars Episode 1, which was shot with a Sony F900, which is a 2/3 inch, basically a souped up television camera. And if you do watch Star Wars Episode 1 now, it does look like a video. It doesn't really have that filmic look. It looks quite different to all the other Star Wars films. But it was a good attempt. But Sony really struggled. And one of the main reasons Sony really struggled was because of the way the pictures looked. And it wasn't to do with the size of the sensor, it was to do with the color science and the colors. Because Sony, being a maker of broadcast cameras, something that has always been important is if you're building a new television studio, perhaps you've already got one with Sony cameras in and you want to build a second one, you'll buy the latest cameras, you'll put those cameras in that studio. You don't actually want them to look different to the other studio. You want your output to look consistent, to look the same. So the color science of Sony's cameras hasn't changed since their very first, or hadn't changed since their very first TV cameras that they were producing in the 1980s. Pretty much a year 2000 TV camera had the same color science as a 1980 camera. And in that time, we went from tube cameras to early CCD cameras and then to CMOS cameras. But Sony always tried to make them look as similar as possible to allow a broadcaster to mix different generations of cameras without a problem. But that was an issue for these guys, for filmmakers, because filmmakers don't want their stuff to look like television. They want to make it look like a feature film, like a movie. And with Sony's F55 camera, I still have one, they really struggled to sell that camera because out of the box, it looked like a TV camera. You can grade that footage, and really you can take any camera and grade it pretty much to look like any other. A lot of this color science isn't now in these cameras that shoot with log or shoot with raw actually baked in. You can choose how it's going to look. But out of the box, the F55 looked like a Sony TV camera, and they really, really struggled to sell it for high-end productions. It was used for a lot of films. It was used in particular for The Crown, the series The Crown, and it looked fabulous when it was handled correctly and used right. But Sony realized they had to make a change, so they went away and they canvassed the market. They spoke to filmmakers, they spoke to cinematographers, and they surveyed film and movie audiences to try and learn how people felt a film should look. And they redeveloped and redesigned their color science to produce a much more film-like look. And we see that now in all of these new cameras, started with the original Venice camera. And the out-of-the-box look is called S709, and we see that in the FX6. We see that now in the FX3, in all the cinema line cameras. And it's very different to the way Sony cameras looked before. So this is a big change for Sony now, this new color science. But Venice 1 was a hard sell for Sony. So we don't actually see a vast number of films made with Venice 1 because the movie industry takes a very long time to change, to rethink, to adapt. But there are a lot of films that were made with Venice 1. And of course, of particular note is Top Gun Mavericks, which I'm sure we've all probably seen. Wrong way. And Sony are now starting to really make waves in the movie production business. And very often now they are the Venice is the camera of choice. So a lot of this is Venice 1, but you'll see your Avatar shot on Venice, Avatar Way of Water, shot with 2 Venices in a 3D rig. And that's actually where the Rialto system was born. So Sony's Rialto allows you to separate the sensor from the camera body on a cable. And that was something that James Cameron wanted for the Avatar movie, so he could put the camera into 3D rigs more easily, where you have 2 cameras in one rig. Ferrari, which is out now on Netflix and things like that, Gran Turismo, and this film won't be out until September this year. 6th of September is the release date. Beetlejuice, which I had a part in. I was a consultant on in-camera special effects. So this is part of the testing for the film. In this particular instance, we've got 2 Venice 2s, with Panavised Venice 2s in a beam splitter 3D rig. So there's another one down here, it's a Rialto, with Panavision lenses. This camera shooting normal full spectrum visible light, this camera shooting infrared for some very clever special effects that we were doing in camera. And I think when the film is released, the opening scene of the film was something that I helped shoot. Helped develop this special shooting technique that was used for that part of the film. Now, why this I think is important to look at this film is not because I was involved in it so much, but also because the director of photography is not in those pictures. You can just see his hat there, Harris Ambalakis. Harris Ambalakis was very much a film director of photography. He did all the Agatha Christie films, and so he shot Murder on the Orient Express using 70mm film. And to do that, he went to Panavision and got Panavision to dig out their old System 65 film cameras, repair them, get them working again, dig out all the old 70mm lenses so he could shoot on 70mm. And it looks great. From a technical standpoint, it looks absolutely fabulous. Because he felt that even, this isn't that long ago, that video cameras like a Venice just weren't there in terms of the textural qualities from the image. He tested Venice 1. He did feel it was a good camera, but didn't feel it was for him. He was getting a better result from 70mm. Then he shot Murder on the Nile, Death on the Nile, and that was 70mm. And then he went to shoot a ghost story in Paris in Venice, and he tested a Venice 2 with the 8K sensor and decided that finally that electronic capture was matching that he was getting with 70mm film. And one of the big issues with 70mm film was that a single magazine weighs 30 kilos. So the camera is huge and incredibly heavy. So he now has decided to shoot, he switched from 70mm film to Venice 2 because he's discovered that the textural quality you get when you shoot at 8K with a very high quality camera with a very deep bit depth, 16-bit recording, is very similar to the textural qualities you get from 70mm film. And even though most of what we watch in the cinema is downscaled and we're watching at 4K or even in 2K in a lot of cinemas still, that brings a lot of benefits to the way, in particular, skin tones look. So he's now shifted to shooting everything with Venice 2. So that's Venice 2. And now we have a new option which sits between the FX9, that workhorse for digital, for TV and documentary type production and movie production, which is Sony's Burano. So although Sony Burano is a Cine Alta camera, it's not a baby Venice. It was never designed to actually be a baby Venice. It was designed to be a camera that sits between Venice and the FX9. And it shares some sort of FX9 type features, and it shares a lot of Venice type features. And it tries to bring that blend of Venice image quality, but with a feature set that people that shoot news and documentaries in particular will find very useful. So it's a new type of camera, for want of a better term, and it opens up the possibility to shoot much more quickly than a Venice perhaps, and do things that you can't do with Venice. So it has a really interesting feature set. You've got very lightweight compared to a Venice. It's about half the weight of a Venice. It's actually not a lot heavier than an FX9. You have the same variable ND filter that the FX9 and FX6 has. It's very quick to set your exposure with the ND filter. And the really interesting thing that no other large sensor digital cinema camera has is we have IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And that works by actually physically moving the sensor. So there are gyroscopic detectors in the camera that feed back the way the camera is moving to the camera sensor system, and it moves the sensor as the camera shakes or wobbles to stabilize the shot. So it has absolutely no impact on image quality. There is no need to crop into the image or anything like that. So it's completely the same image quality, but now you have the ability to have stabilization. And then we have Sony's amazing autofocus with the very latest chipset in Burano, which features AI to do human person detection. And I'll go into that in a bit more in a minute. We have a different sensor to Sony Venice. It's not the same sensor, but it does give us full frame at 8.6K. There's a huge amount of discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, on social media about this at the moment, is where these sensors come from. So Sony makes sensors. They're a manufacturer of sensors. Designing and developing a sensor is a very complicated process, and there are different parts to a sensor. So if we start right at the beginning of a sensor, you have what's called the photosite, or perhaps more commonly the pixel, which is a piece of silicon, a diode that converts light into electricity, into photons of light into electrons of electricity. Then that is stored in something called the image well, which is a storage area, and then it's read out. The most important part of the sensor from an image quality point of view is the quality of that photodiode. How efficiently does it convert light into electricity? How much noise does it have? And how good is the color response? And there's something else you get really technical about, which is called the MTF, modulation transfer function, which I'm not going to go into that now. Basically, from what I've been able to determine, and a lot of other people that have looked at these sensors, is that Sony Venice, Burano, and Sony's A1 camera all share the very same photodiodes. The design of that part of the sensor is the same across all of them. And that's why, in terms of color, dynamic range, and things like that, Burano, Venice 2 that is, and the A1 perform very, very similarly. Now, there are other differences beyond that. So once we've got this signal, how do we read it out? And this is where there is a big difference between Burano and Venice. The Venice sensor has extra layers of silicon that are a memory, and the signal from the photodiodes, from the pixels, is read into that memory, and then the memory can be read out of the chip. So basically, Venice has the ability to dump all at the same time all the information from the pixels into a memory, and then the memory can be read out in the background. And that allows you to have virtually zero rolling shutter. Burano, however, is a slightly different chip, and the pixels are read out one at a time, one after the other, and that takes a bit longer, it's a little bit slower, so there is more rolling shutter in a Burano than there is in a Venice. That is a fact of life, and when you have more pixels, so we have 8K of pixels in a Burano compared to the 4K in an FX6, it takes a lot longer to read those pixels out simply because there's more of them. So there are differences in rolling shutter performance between Burano and an FX6, largely just because Burano has a lot more pixels to read out. But they are exceptionally high quality pixels, and they give us this vast, vast color palette to work from. And that color palette is really important. I'll come back to that in a minute. Burano takes either E-mount or PL lenses. It's supplied with a PL mount. The PL mount comes off, and behind that is Sony's locking E-mount. And that just means that you have an immense amount of lens flexibility, because you can get adapters from E-mount to Canon if you want, to EF, to LPL. You can put an LPL mount on here. So there's pretty much any lens that you want will work on a Burano. And the variable ND, the image stabilization, and all of those things will work with any lens, whether that's a PL lens or a Sony E-mount lens. And it's one of the things that I really like about this camera. So I have a large number of Sony E-mount lenses, and I can use that on my Burano. In fact, actually, that's probably the reason why my f55 that I've got, even though it's a 12-year-old camera, it's a really good camera, I don't use it anymore, is I can't put E-mount lenses on it. If I could put E-mount lenses on my f55, I'd probably use it a lot more than I do, but you can't. So I don't have a huge amount of PL lenses. In fact, I don't have any PL lenses. I rent them in as I need them, because generally they're expensive. So we're having this ability to use just about any lens is amazing. Now, we do have Robin from Sony, who will talk much more about lenses a little bit later on, and I'm actually really looking forward to watching that presentation and learning from that, because there are so many lenses to choose from now. I have yet to find a bad one. Even the really cheap lenses from Sony perform well, considering what they cost. Just picking a couple here, a couple of favorites of mine, the 24mm 1.4, absolutely fabulous lens if you do anything with stars and do stuff at night. Obviously 24 to 70 is a big favorite with everybody. It's a really nice range. And then the 70, it's not on here. The other one I use a lot is the 200 to 600. It's a really nice lens. So you have a huge range of lenses from Sony, but I'll leave that to Robin later on. The whole idea behind Burano, though, is to give you the ability to use it in a lot of different ways depending on what you do. So for the type of thing that I do, which is a lot of documentary type production, I tend to use it with Sony's E-mount lenses, because you have autofocus, which actually now I use it. The autofocus that we have in these cameras, and those of you that are familiar with the FX6 and FX3 will know how good Sony's autofocus is now. It's actually quite transformative. If we rewind and go back 5 years, I would have probably stood in front of a group like this, perhaps talking about an FS7, maybe an F5 or 55, and said, well, as a professional filmmaker, why the hell would I ever want to use autofocus? because I can focus much better than autofocus can. So I prefer to manually focus where I have full control. Now I'm going to stand in front of you guys and say, why the hell would I want to manually focus when I have a really good lens that can autofocus better than I can manually focus? In a very short period of time, autofocus has improved beyond all recognition. I was at NAB last week in the US, and there's lots of stuff going on there. I see that Moon have just released their latest version of their autofocus system for cinema cameras that uses a additional camera and a LiDAR system. So it's a combination of a camera and a LiDAR system that mounts on top of the camera to measure distance, to look at what you're shooting, analyze what you're shooting, and then drive a traditional focus motor to give you autofocus with a cinema lens. And there is tremendous interest in this system from focus pullers and ACs that work in the film industry. I watched June 2 over the weekend, and I spotted quite a few out of focus shots in that film where the talent has moved towards the camera, or the camera is moving, and you just see it go slightly out of focus. You know, when we shoot now with these large sensors, with full frame sensors, the depth of field is really shallow now. And in fact, actually, one of the shots that I noticed was particularly challenging focus wise was when they used a rehoused Helios 44-2 lens, a 58mm Helios lens, you swirly bokeh, really unique out of focus areas. And I noticed that when they were shooting some of the stuff with that lens, that the AC, the focus assistants, were clearly struggling to get that lens sharp. Now, I've used those lenses as well, and their focus is a little bit funky. Now, these are rehoused, but just because of the way the bokeh is, it's actually the difference between when they're sharp and not it's not always distinct. So you can be slightly out of focus and not perhaps notice it. So there's a huge amount of interest now in finding ways to focus better than human beings can. If you think about how all the focus pullers work now, they'll have a follow focus and they'll be looking at a monitor. So how do they know when they're not in focus? Well, it's because the picture goes blurry, and then they bring it back into focus. Well, it's too late now. The shot's already ruined, because they're always very slightly behind. If you're looking at a monitor, now on Beetlejuice, it was fascinating to work with the first AC. Oh, I can't remember his name, but the first AC on that, old school film first AC, he's there with his tape measure. And then he's looking at points in the scene. What are my reference points? And he's doing everything by eye. He did not have a monitor. He's doing it the old-fashioned way. And it was quite interesting because he was never behind with the focus. So he would see the actor move towards the camera, and he's turning the focus dial almost before the actor's actually physically moved, because he knows what's coming in the set. So he was never ever behind with the focus. Then his assistant would be looking at a big monitor and checking focus on the monitor. And at the end of each take, the two of them, the first AC and the assistant, would get together, and it's like, was it all sharp? Was it correct? Was it in focus? And it was either a yes or no. Do we need to retake it for focus or not? But he never ever pulled off a monitor. He was always pulling using tape measure, marks, and he would follow the camera operator here. He'd be here next to the camera operator, so he's the correct distance. He did have cine tape on the camera, and he would use that as a reference, but it was all done that way. But getting focus right is a huge challenge now with large sensor cameras. So I'm more than happy to allow Sony's autofocus with their E-mount lenses to do it for me, because it's so accurate now that generally it's better than I could do myself, because it's going to focus on the person's eyes. And focusing on somebody's eyes is really difficult because they're a very small thing in the shot. And all too often I might be looking at and I'm focusing on somebody's face if I'm doing it manually. And I might get their nose in focus or their earlobes in focus, but their eyes are slightly out. Whereas Sony's AF takes care of all of that. And it's highly programmable. I'm going to show you a clip in a moment that I shot in Norway, and it's all autofocus. And it was cold up there. It wasn't that super cold. I go in January as well, generally, when it's minus 30 to minus 40. This year it was minus 43. You got big mittens on. Trying to operate a small lens and focus it is difficult. You're struggling to actually see anything in the viewfinder, because even with a nice monocular viewfinder like this, you put your eye up against it and it fogs up and it freezes over. All of those things make it far more challenging than it should be. So again, autofocus, if you can trust it and rely on it, which you can, is going to make your life much easier. So we can shoot this style with an E-mount lens, and that's generally how I use Burano most of the time. But we can also shoot with a PL lens, either for one-man band shooting or for what's only called project style shooting, which is your sort of film style with a crew type shooting. So I was involved with 2 films. I'll come back to these films in a moment. Let me show you the film from Norway, because this is an ENG. This is very much a sort of documentary type capture. So let's just have a look. And I think this is really the sort of the type of production that Burano really excels at. Oh, let's go back to the... main aim of this shoot was to actually get these plates of the Northern Lights for a virtual production project. But I used the Burano to do this, and one of the things I had to do was to chase the weather. So this was shot 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. It's kind of late in the winter to go and try and shoot the Northern Lights because the night is much shorter up in Norway, so you have a very narrow window of opportunity to actually get the aurora because it's only fully dark for about 2 hours in the night at that point. And I had to drive to where I felt the best weather was. So what doesn't come across so much in a lot of this footage is just how windy it was. It was incredibly windy. And that made just getting stable shots of the aurora, because I was having to use quite long exposures, difficult. But because of the IBIS in Burano, I was able to use that to get stable shots, yeah.
One of them is, how is the I think there's one on the FX3, right? And
Yeah.
on the FS7, for instance.
So FS7 doesn't have IBIS, so the FS7, the only stabilization the FS7 would have been from a stabilized lens, whereas the IBIS that's in Burano and also in the FX3 is this moving the sensor to stabilize. And generally, I find the IBIS to be more effective than a stabilized lens. But if you have a stabilized lens and IBIS, the two work together. So if I show you, let's have a look. I think I got it in this. Let's see if I can find. I'm not sure where it is. I've got some examples somewhere in here, I think, of
shooting just general scenery shots. And the last couple of days, we've had some absolutely gorgeous weather.
did have beautiful blue skies.
Blue sky. It's been wonderful.
But it's also, yeah, super windy.
So the one thing that's really
And so these shots are all done with IBIS.
having IBIS, the in-body stabilization.
And I've got some examples where I turn it
to
off.
this button here. And the last couple of days, in the real strong high winds, it's allowed me to get rock solid stable shots where otherwise I wouldn't have been able to have shot decent footage. So that's made a tremendous difference. And it's also really, really bright. Like a lot of
I thought I had an on-off example
bright
somewhere.
like this, because it is super bright out here with all the sun and everything else. Trying to see the
Yeah, so also because I filmed on the ferries, there's all, again, with IBIS. But I think there's an example in here somewhere coming up. I mean, this is also really a big deal, is having this viewfinder loop when it was as bright as it was, filming in everything is white. You've got the snow, you've got a bright sky. Even I couldn't see my phone screen, I couldn't see the screen on the LCD. Being able to close that loop and look in the viewfinder, suddenly you can actually see it. Here we are.
in-body stabilization. Great autofocus, which
Yeah.
the camera has as well. When you're outside and it's
I mean,
-11,
if I didn't hold, in some of the places, if I didn't actually hold on to the tripod was going to blow over. Opening the door of the car, it was boom. And then fighting to close the door of the car again, it was that windy. But in the shots, you wouldn't know it. You just wouldn't know it. And I couldn't have done those shots without the stabilization. I just couldn't. Yeah.
How much of this are the pure footage from Burano, and how much has been done in post afterwards?
All the stabilization is in camera.
Yeah, but I was thinking about the colors.
I'm shooting XOCN, so I'm shooting in 16-bit RAW. So the footage is graded. You can't not grade RAW. It has to go through a process to turn it from that RAW image to a viewable image. So the workflow was to take it into an ACES workflow. I use ACES a lot. But there's not a huge amount of grading. It's not heavily graded. It's pretty close to how it came, or how it looks straight out of the camera. It's HDR, so it's an HDR TV that you're viewing it on, which really helps. But the one thing I've generally find with a camera like Burano is you don't have to do a lot of grading to it because it looks so nice straight out of the camera. And there's another film I'm going to show you in a minute. And again, I show it to people and they go, oh, there must be so much grading in that. It's like, no, this is pretty much how it looks. And I do actually have some of the footage from Norway with me. And I'll show you that later on, taking it into ACES. And you'll see it's pretty much what you see on here is how it looks coming out of the camera. At the back.
Just a question about the holy great time-lapse thing you do, the day to night.
Yes.
Is it by the ISO or you adjust the actual amount of light sensitivity? Or is it
That's a single shot, single exposure. There's no change in aperture or anything else in that shot. In those day to night shots, they are just direct from the camera. This is when you're going to night. So in the past, I might have done that with something like an FX3 or an FX6, which is more sensitive. The Burano isn't as sensitive as those cameras, so I was having to use longer exposures. But generally, your most challenging part, there's two challenges. One is getting the daytime shot not overexposed and then going to the night. But when you've got a 16-bit codec like XOCN, so one of the things you have to remember, this is a lot of these cameras that shoot log or raw, they're what we call ISO invariant. So the sensor itself in Burano has two sensitivities. Anything else, if you change the ISO away from the base sensitivity, it's just adding gain either in the camera or in post-production. Now, gain is gain. You can add gain to a shot in the camera, or you can add gain to the shot in post-production. The effect is exactly the same. It's not different. Because electronic sensors are ISO invariant, you have two choices as to how you shoot. You can either add that gain in the camera, so when you raise the ISO in a conventional shooting mode, you're adding gain to what the sensor outputs in the camera, or you can add the gain in post-production. So you shoot at the camera's native sensitivity, record the best quality recording of that you can. In the case of Burano, that's 16-bit XOCN, and you add the gain in post-production. The effect is the same. And the beauty of doing it with a camera like Burano and shooting with that 16-bit XOCN codec is essentially you're taking everything that the sensor can capture anyway, and then you can vary your gain in post-production. So in post-production, as we go to night, I'm just bringing the gain up, which would be the same as using automatic gain control in the camera. It's not different. But because I'm doing it afterwards, I have much more control. And I can then look at, there is noise reduction on the Northern Lights footage. It's not I have used noise reduction, but I can bring in the gain, and as the gain comes up, I can increase my noise reduction to match and do all of that with much greater control and gain a much better result than trying to do it in the camera at the time of shooting. And this is what XOCN brings you, is when you try to do stuff like that, you're capturing the full 16-bit output of the sensor, taking that into post-production, and that gives you a tremendous grading flexibility in post-production that you don't get quite the same degree of flexibility with a shallower bit depth such as 10-bit. So having 16-bit. Yes, yeah. I'm a long time. I used to use Premiere for everything, but with more modern cameras and more modern workflows, Premiere has not really kept up. And yeah, what you can do in Resolve now is absolutely incredible compared to what you can do in Premiere, especially in terms of grading and separating colors out and color management and all of those things. It's going off track a little bit. I think this is something that everybody needs to really start thinking about, is color management, even if you're just shooting with an FX3 or an FX6, because how many people here are delivering in HDR now? Yeah, one or two. That's fairly typical. I do most of these events and one or two people put their hands up. How many people have got an iPhone that's more recent than an iPhone 11? Yeah. So you've got HDR phones with HDR screens. How many people bought a TV in the last 4 years? Yes, probably an HDR capable TV. It might not be the greatest, but it probably is going to be HDR capable. we're going to be a society very soon where most people's viewing devices, whether that's a laptop, computer, a phone, a television, a tablet, will be HDR. Why aren't we delivering in HDR? It's because people are scared of it. They're afraid of it. They don't understand it. But it is going to come, and it will become normal. Yeah.
Also, there are no demand for it. Most customers would like an full HD picture. So that.
Yeah, like the difference between HD and 4K is small. The difference between HDR done properly and standard dynamic range done properly is huge and far, far more noticeable. You start delivering to a client in HDR, they don't want to go back. They will not go back because they can see the difference. If you look on this, the behind the scenes clip is SDR, the main clip is HDR. The difference in image quality is quite striking, but they're both the same 4K resolution. There's no resolution difference, but one is clearly better than the other. And that's where we're going. And TVs, monitors, laptops, they're all going to get better. They're not going to get worse. So HDR is something you really, really need to understand. If you ever have ambitions of doing stuff for Netflix, Amazon, for any of those guys, you need to understand HDR because they demand HDR. They will not take SDR deliverables unless it's something very, very cheap. So, and your HDR workflow is no more difficult than an SDR workflow. It's not like it's harder. It isn't. It's just as easy. It's not difficult. You just need to understand it, just as we understand SDR workflows. And we are at the moment in an interim period where we will need to deliver, in a lot of cases, HDR and SDR, because some clients will need SDR or still want SDR and some will want HDR. But eventually, and it's not that far away, HDR delivery will be normal because that's what everybody's devices will support. I wouldn't want to deliver an SDR now because my TV, my phone, it all looks better on every device that I've got now. And a color managed workflow makes that so easy. You take your XOCN or your S-Log3 from a Sony camera, you just tell DaVinci Resolve, which does color management really, really well, that you want to output in HDR, and that's it. It's done. It's HDR. It's not harder than that. A lot of people seem to think it is harder than that, but it's not. It is in other software, but in Resolve in particular, it's particularly easy. And I think it's something we really need to start thinking about and embracing a lot more because it's not going to go away. And Rec 709, I mean, when we went from SD to HD, we had the same thing. Everyone's going, oh, I don't need to deliver in HD. Who's going to want HD? Why do I need to do HD? Nobody will want that. It won't catch on. Well, it did. And we're now in HDR is going to be the same. And it's not going to go away. It will become normal. So you do need to get your head around it if you don't already understand it. And in a lot of respects, it actually makes life a lot easier because you're not trying to crush highlights all the time to try and make highlights work on an SDR screen. HDR can be quite liberating. At NAB last week, Sony was showing their latest TVs and monitors that now do 4,000 nits, which is 4 times more than what most HDR devices do right now. And it's beautiful. Some of the skies and some of those images is just astounding. But these are only monitors that big. These aren't great big TVs. So it could have been HD or it could have been 4K. You wouldn't have noticed the resolution difference because they were small screens. But it was so beautiful, that HDR footage on those small screens. So it's something we do need to be aware of. So I was involved with some very early films shot on Burano. And just before I actually move on, coming back to Norway. So Norway, the stuff that I got in Norway, the daytime scenes in that strong wind, high winds, and some of the aurora footage just would not have been possible without IBIS and stabilization. Couldn't have done it. And then the variable ND filter, shooting in that brilliantly bright sunlight. I've got 2.1 ND in most of the time during the day. And the variable ND and the autofocus, the fact that I can close the loop on the viewfinder and look into it on that bright light. I could not. If I'd have gone to do that shoot and I'd taken my FX6, an out-of-the-box FX6 like this, I would have struggled because of the lack of stabilization, the lack of the IBIS stabilization, and the lack of a viewfinder loop. It would have been really hard to have got that footage. Burano made it easy. Just jump out the car, shoot. Simple. If you're doing documentaries, if you're doing run and gun stuff, that's what you want. You don't want it to be difficult, because when it's easy, that's when you come back with great looking footage. When it's difficult, when you're fighting with the camera or struggling, the footage doesn't look as good because it's hard. It's a very simple thing, but I don't think a lot of people really appreciate what a big difference having a camera that works with you compared to having a camera that you have to really work against makes. If I'd have taken Venice 2 to Norway to do that same week of shooting, I don't think the footage would have been as good. I really don't. Burano was the right camera for that particular job. If I'd have taken a red Komodo X, yeah, it's got global shutters, so what? It's not stabilized. It takes 30 seconds to boot up. This thing boots up in 2 seconds. The low light performance isn't quite as good. It doesn't have a variable ND filter, all of those things. I would not have come back with that footage. It would not have worked. Yeah.
You just talked about global shutter. Why haven't they put global shutter in the Burano?
Because Sony haven't yet developed the technology with their sensors that gives them the same sensitivity and the same lack of noise with global shutter. The A9, they have the A9 Mark III has a global shutter sensor in it, but it's lower resolution, bigger pixels, and it's relatively noisy compared to this. So there's generally trade-offs when different technologies impose different limitations on what you can do. So perhaps they could have put an A9 sensor in a Burano, but you'd have lost a bit of dynamic range, you'd have lost some sensitivity, you'd have more noise, you'd have lower resolution. Is that what the market wants right now? I'm not completely convinced it is. The rolling shutter in Burano is not as bad as the rolling shutter in the FX9. There's an immense amount of footage, really great footage shot with FX9s, and nobody's really complaining about the rolling shutter in those. Did you see any issues with rolling shutter in? Yeah, okay. Admittedly, a lot of it's on a tripod. A lot of it is very stable. But I'm going to show you several other films that were shot with Burano. And, okay, day one, when was it? August last year, pre-production Burano. We're shooting the first of these films I'm going to show you in a moment, some of one. I noticed there was some rolling shutter. Was it a problem? No. Shot with it. And what surprised me actually about this whole rolling shutter thing is these films have been available online to watch for months, and nobody's picked up on the rolling shutter in them. It's there if you look for it, if you look hard enough. But we've had rolling shutter cameras for a very, very long time. And in fact, film suffers from rolling shutter. Film has a shutter that wipes through the frame from top to bottom. And if you look carefully enough on film, there is skew. There are rolling shutter issues in film. So it's not a new thing by any means. So the next film I'm going to show you, it's called The Sum of One. It was shot in South Africa. I was the DIT and I wasn't the director of photography, but I was DIT, responsible basically for image quality and how this film looks. And this was a really challenging shoot. All handheld, or mostly all handheld. A lot of moving shots. There are shots from vehicles, tracking shots, moving shots, and it really challenged the camera. And again, it was having the IBIS where we wanted it. A lot of this was IBIS was actually turned off because we wanted a more rugged, more gritty look to it. Mostly shot with the Cooke SP3 lenses, so all the studio stuff is all shot with the SP3 prime lenses. And it's a really interesting film. Then we shot a second film, which I'll show you in a little bit, which was called The Uncertainty Principle, and this is all shot with Sony G Master lenses. And the idea here was to show two different ways of shooting. One is a crude shoot, with a large crew. We had a focus puller, a first AC, looking after focus with the prime lenses. They're not autofocus lenses. I was their DIT, so I was managing the camera, controlling the camera. So we actually had the camera configured for studio shooting. So let's watch some of one. Oops.
Success. It's often elusive, but it's attainable. You just have to start. It starts with you. Success comes from you, not at you. Work independently. Chase it. Dream it. Taste it. Take action. Small steps forward. Try and fail. Fail but learn. Get up and do it again. Get up and do it again. Get up and do it again. Until you join others with skills of their own.
Scene 3, take 1.
So that's handheld, it's
Sony.
wobbly, there's tracking shots through trees and things like that. Was rolling shutter an issue in that film? No. It's there. I'm sure if you put a straight edge up against the monitor and checked very carefully, you'd be able to see that there is some skew in there. It's not skew free, but it's not a problem. It really, really isn't an issue. It's not something that concerns me. So that film was shot sort of film style. So the camera was configured with the LCD screen mounted on this side of the camera, which it's designed to do. So let me just very quickly. So there's a little screw under here. Actually, I noticed this hasn't been loosened. That you can loosen when the camera comes, makes this easier to move. It's actually meant to be loosened. Hasn't been done on this camera yet. So I can put my arm on here, take the loop off here. Just think about the easiest way to do this. And now I can have my LCD screen on this side of the camera so that the camera assistant can control the camera. And if I press the home button on here now, I have this menu here that is virtually identical to the one on a Sony Venice. So a first AC or camera assistant that's used to working with Venice will find this very familiar. They'll have all the same controls that they'll have on a Venice. Now there's an interesting thing that happens when you do this. So let me just bring the camera back up on here. So if I turn the home menu off, it's called the home menu, on the monitor here we have all of this information over the picture. When I press the home button and we have this different menu system, most of that stuff goes away, and the things that do remain, time code, the audio meters, they can be turned off in the menu. So you can have a clean output, and you can just have your basically you can just have your markers on the monitor outputs, on the SDI and HDMI outputs. And this is how, if you're working on a feature, most people would like to have their camera configured. Let me just bring up the main menu, because generally, let's go to my monitoring and bring up the markers. Oops. I need to, I haven't set up the buttons on this yet. But if I just bring up a safety zone marker like that, as soon as I press the home button, we get that much cleaner display. And this would be fed to the video village, DIT station, etc., without all the clutter over the viewfinder. And the other thing happens when the camera is configured this way is if I now go into the menus, generally I don't know what's been assigned on this camera. Normally I would assign menu onto one of the buttons on here. Haven't done it yet. If I bring up the menus, if you look at this LCD, you can see I have the camera menu on here, but the menus won't appear on the output. So what this means is that the camera assistant, DIT, if they need to change real numbers, check things like that, they can go into the menus, they can change the camera settings without ever affecting the SDI or HDMI output. So you have that clean, if you want it to be clean feed on the SDI or HDMI, but you can still go into the menus and things like that on the monitor. So this is designed for this crude type of shooting. And if I press the home button, we go back to a traditional output, and now when I bring up the menus, it will come up over the output. So the camera operates in two different ways depending on whether you've pressed the home button on here or not. So it's quite different. So it's designed to operate in two key ways, with the home menu displayed, a cleaner output to feed to your video village, with the home menu not being displayed, menus, overlays, everything else gets sent out on the SDIs, depending on what you need for the type of shoot. So for this film, it was set up this way because I'm driving a lot of the stuff on the camera here, changing settings, maybe changing look profiles and all of those things, while the camera operator is thinking about his framing, his composition, and all of those things, and I don't disturb what he's looking at. So it's a different way of running the camera. We did use it on gimbal. It's a Ronin 2. A very, very easy camera to set up on a gimbal. The sort of the box shape and the fact that it's relatively short makes it really easy to balance. And we were using the Cooke SP3 lenses. And in fact, if you just strip this right down to just the camera body and lens, it will actually go on an RS3 or RS4 Pro. Very small gimbals. That really opens up the flexibility to all very interesting shooting stuff that you can't do with a Venice very easily. Even with a Rialto, with the Venice, you still have a fairly large camera head, and then you have the umbilical cable still to deal with in the camera body. So it does allow you to shoot in a very flexible way. So does it look like a Venice? Absolutely. I've put Burano and Venice 2 side by side, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference. In fact, I would actually say anybody that can tell the difference either the footage hasn't been shot the same, there's some other issue, or I don't know, they're making it up, because I can't tell the difference when I have Venice footage and Burano footage side by side when it's been shot equally well in both cases. But it isn't the same sensor as Venice 2. For a start, Burano has autofocus, so it has extra pixels for phase detection, or the pixels are different for phase detection. Venice doesn't have those. Venice doesn't have autofocus. But the color space, dynamic range, everything else is pretty much identical between the two cameras. What can it record? It can record a lot of different frame sizes and scan sizes, starting at full frame 8.6K, which is my favorite way of shooting with Burano. And generally I'm doing that, I'm recording with the XOCN codec for that maximum grading flexibility. But you can also shoot with XAVC HI, a new codec, at 8.6K. Then we have this slightly smaller crop, which is a 6K readout from the sensor, but it's only 0.7% crop. It's a tiny crop. You barely notice it. But that, if you're using that with XOCN, gives you some serious data savings. Your file sizes are much smaller. And then we have Super 35 at 5.8K and a smaller crop here, which you have to use if you want to shoot a 4K 120 frames per second, and that's a 4K readout. Now, the big thing with all of these sensors that we have now, all these single chip sensors, they use something called a Bayer sensor. So one sensor does all three colors, red, green, and blue. Previously, we'd have used three sensors, one for red, one for green, one for blue. But now we're using a single sensor. So not every point on the sensor is seeing every color. And as a result of that, because we have more green, most of our luminance information comes from the green pixels, we have greater resolution in green and in luma than we do in color. Our chroma resolution is a lot lower than the brightness resolution. Now, it does depend on what you're shooting and what colors are in the shots and a lot of other things. But essentially, a camera with a 4K Bayer sensor can't resolve a 4K image. Or if it did, it would be full of aliasing and moire and other image issues that you don't want. We do see a little bit of moire actually in the FX6 and FX3 when you have very finely colored textures. So you might have a very finely woven fabric that might be strongly colored, and because the red and the blue resolution is lower than the green, in certain circumstances you'll get rainbow patterns over that, because the optical filtering in the camera has been tuned to try and create a very sharp, very high resolution image. But because of this imbalance between the color and brightness information in certain circumstances, you can get colored moire. Whereas the 8K sensor in Burano, it's much higher resolution sensor. So when we're delivering in 4K, because very few of us are going to be delivering in 8K anytime soon. So most of us are going to deliver in 4K. That downsampling from what's captured to that 4K image means that we end up with equal red, green, and blue color in our deliverable. And what that leads to is really better skin tones. Because if you think about a face, faces aren't green, they're more red than green. There's actually a lot of blue in skin as well. So by having a lot more blue and red samples from an 8K sensor than we have in a 4K sensor. In a 4K sensor, there's only 2K. It's not even HD, or it's barely HD. We get much nicer looking skin tones because we're able to see all those textural differences that actually exist in a face. So shooting with an 8K sensor really does bring benefits when you're delivering in 4K because we have equal resolution in our colors in our final deliverable, and that makes a difference. It really does. So the second film I'm going to show you now, this is called The Uncertainty Principle. It's a bit of a knockoff of lots of stuff borrowed, stolen, whatever from Oppenheimer. But this was basically a one-man band. So this is single camera operator. There's no assistant. There was an assistant just to help rigging lights and things like that, and me helping on the technical side. But basically this is shot single shooter style, autofocus, Sony G Master lenses, very much simpler shoot, very much smaller budget, just to show how the camera can work when it's configured that way. And in particular in this, look at the skin tones. There's lots of big close-ups of the faces in this, and they look gorgeous. So let me just bring back the videos. No. And actually, this whole 8K and oversampling was something I spotted when Venice 2 came out. So I'd shot a lot of stuff on Venice 1 with a 6K sensor, and I thought that looked fabulous. Then Sony bring out Venice 2 with the 8.6K sensor. I'm like, why do you want an 8K sensor? I'm only delivering in 4K. I don't need an 8K sensor. Files are going to be huge. I don't want it. Started shooting 8.6K on Venice 2. And in fact, the very first day I used the camera, I was completely sold on shooting in 8K. It's like, wow, this looks so nice at 4K because of that downsampling and color.
If we could observe the electron, at any one instant, the electron would be found at some particular location.
So there's a lot of discussion, anybody that's sort of on social media and things like that, about bit depths and things like that. And we often, I think most of us are aware that 10-bit is better than 8-bit, and probably that 12-bit is going to be better than 10-bit, and 16-bit is going to be better than 12-bit, and so on. You get a similar benefit with resolution, even when you're viewing at a lower resolution, because you're increasing the number of samples that you have. Bit depth increases the number of samples. And it's kind of, if you think about it, perhaps if you think about bit depth being the number of samples that you have that way in your image, the thickness of your negative in terms of the number of shades it has. Well, resolution is that way. And if you have a higher resolution, you have more samples. And when you downsample that, and it's the same with bit depth, we might capture in 16-bit or 12-bit or 10-bit and deliver an 8-bit H.264 file. But I think most of us are aware that if you shot at 10-bit, even if you're delivering in H.264, which is 8-bit, it's going to be better than if you shot in 8-bit. And if you shoot in 16-bit, you have so much more that your final deliverable will look better. Resolution is the same. If you have a much higher resolution, you are starting out with more image information. And when you get that combination, though, with Burano, where you have both the high resolution, that 8K capture, and 16-bit, you have so much information in your negative, in your XOCN, that you can really manipulate that and make that look really incredible. And Venice 2 with its 8.6K sensor really opened my eyes to how important oversampling with single sensor cameras in particular is, and what that brings to your end result, even to lower resolution. Let alone the fact that you can crop in and do all of those other things which are nice as well. It is having that extra textural information and that in your captured image that really does make a big difference to your end result. So we have all of these different capture modes. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. From the full frame capture, you're essentially limited to XOCN LT or XAVC HI. This is a new H.265 codec from Sony. And actually, if you don't want the XOCN, even this looks absolutely incredible and fantastic and is very highly gradable. So if you want smaller file sizes, these are quite manageable. This one's 500 megabits per second at 8K. XAVC I in 4K is 300. Yes, it's 300 megabits per second. So it is a 60% increase in bit rate, but you're getting a heck of a lot more image information. And it looks absolutely fabulous. So yeah, really nice. And then once you go down to the 6K crop, we can also shoot in 4K, so you can record 4K or even in HD using the XAVC codecs that we know from the FX6, etc. And again, from Super 35, we can shoot in XOCN, or we can shoot 4K or HD. And this is one of the things that's really nice about these cameras with the 8.6K sensor in particular, is that even when you shoot Super 35, and there's lots of reasons to shoot Super 35 still. If you want a zoom lens, if you want a cine-style zoom lens, your choices at Super 35 are huge compared to at full frame. There are not many fast full frame zooms out there because it's very difficult optically to make a fast lens for a very big sensor, especially zoom lenses. They get very big and very heavy very quickly, and when that front element, that front piece of glass, basically the bigger your sensor is, the bigger that front piece of glass needs to be. The cost to get that piece of glass, to actually just manufacture the glass, let alone grind it to the right shape, becomes a lot more expensive. And that's why these lenses are cheap. Fujinon Primistas, 60,000-70,000 euros for 4 times zoom lenses. They're not great zoom range. Whereas you go down to Super 35 and you've got the old Cabrios, you've got the Canon CN7s, so many more choices for a third of the price. But with this camera, Super 35 is still 5.8K. It's still oversampled for a 4K deliverable. So it's still a fantastic looking image. And I'm a huge fan of full frame. I love shooting full frame. I really do. But I would not want to buy for filmmaking, for digital cinema, a camera now that doesn't sample at least 5.8K in Super 35 as well. Because it gives you so much more flexibility in what lenses you can use and how you can shoot. Sometimes full frame, the depth of field is too difficult, it's too shallow. Sometimes you want a slightly deeper depth of field. So having that ability to decide, well, shall I shoot this Super 35 or shall I shoot this in full frame, and in both cases have an oversampled image, is absolutely wonderful. And if we want to go to 120 frames per second, we do have to drop down into this smaller scan size to get down to Super 35. So I do have to take a break because you're probably all falling asleep by now. So we'll come back to this later on as to what is XOCN, and we'll look at workflow and the cinema line in much more depth after lunch. So what I'm going to show you while I'm still just sort of plugging stuff in and getting organized, this is a film that I shot with the FX30. So this is that really great little low cost, cheap as anything camera. So this is some circus that I filmed. So that's the FX30, and that's a little APS-C camera, really great little camera. Now, while I've got this TV up, I shoot a tremendous amount with the cinema line cameras and all sorts of different things. So this is another video. So this is mainly FX6 this time. Yes, FX6. Yeah, the FX6. So one of the nice things with the FX6 is that it has cache record. So when I'm shooting the lightning in the thunderstorms, I can point the camera at the storm, trying to work out where the lightning's going to occur, and just leave it and sit down, have a beer, something like that. Wait for a bolt of lightning, press record, because the camera takes, depending on how it's set up, to about 30 seconds before you've pressed the record button when you hit that record button. And it's one of the, for somebody anyway that does natural history type productions, it's an amazingly useful feature. Burano has cache record as well. The FX9 has cache record. And it's something that I find incredibly useful. I don't use it all of the time, but there's so many times when it's very useful. And there's a few tricks actually you can do with cache record. One of which is I often have to do productions where I might need to hand off clips or highlights. So I might be filming, let's say, something really boring, like a corporate presentation in a seminar, and I need, though, to hand off highlights to an editor to do a highlight reel before, or virtually as soon as the event's finished, the highlight reel is edited. So you need a way of isolating key points in a presentation. Now you could do it with timecode, you could do it with shot markers, there's various different ways. But if you turn on cache record, there's a really interesting thing that happens, is that when you stop recording, provided you start recording again before the cache is empty, so if you're shooting in HD, that's 30 seconds, you end up with 2 clips with no gap between the 2 clips. So you can break down something like a corporate presentation into chunks with no gaps. So each little bit is a separate clip, but if you join them all back up again in the timeline, there won't be a gap. And that allows you to, in something like a presentation, have it in much smaller chunks. And then you can say, well, it's the really good bit was in the 5th clip. And he hasn't got to go through the whole presentation to find that bit, because everything's broken down into chunks. And with, of course, most of these cameras, one of the big differences between the Sonys and a Red, and I found this particularly beneficial with Burano and Venice, is you've got 2 card slots. So you can use cache record to switch card slots when you want to without a gap in your recording. You can just press the slot button and the camera will switch, but what I like to do is use the cache record, stop recording, press the button, switch slots, start recording again, and again you won't have a gap between your clips so long as you do it within the cache period. And though that's a really useful feature, one thing to be aware of with the picture cache, though, is not just pictures, it's also sound. So if you're shooting something and you're using a nice 15-20 second long cache, and you're discussing the affair that you're having with the director's wife, just before you press record, that sound recording ends up in the edit suite. So, yeah, you do need to be careful what you're talking about. Oh, this producer's crap. I don't want to ever work with this producer again. Press record. Producer's sitting in the edit suite. So the cameraman thinks I'm crap and he doesn't want to work with me again. Well, he won't. Simple as that. So just be aware of that. You need to be a little bit careful what you're discussing off camera. So very, very useful feature. Right, coming back to this. What is XOCN? Because I've touched on this already. XOCN is one of these wonderfully named things from Sony. It's Extended Original Camera Negative. Where they come up with these names, I have no idea. It's beyond me. But it's essentially 16-bit RAW. There was a time when Sony weren't allowed to call it RAW because of a patent dispute that exists between Sony and Red and various other, well, between Sony and Red. But it seems now they're freely calling it RAW because that's what it is, and it's 16-bit compressed RAW. 16-bit compressed RAW gives you amazing grading flexibility. You're basically taking what the sensor captures directly into post-production. And this is a wonderful codec to work with. And it's also incredibly efficient. Now, a lot of people are probably afraid of shooting in 8K with 16-bit RAW because it all sounds very scary. And yeah, I'm not going to lie to you, the files are big. They're not small, but they're not nearly as scary as perhaps you might think. Now, this slide was originally developed with the earlier cameras, with the f55. This is 4K, and XOCN ST, the standard quality, 660 megabits per second. And if we compare that to Class 300 XAVC, it's about 3 times bigger. So yeah, it's a bigger file. But if we compare that with a lot of other formats, if we compare that with ProRes HQ, it's actually smaller. Okay, that's 4K to 4K. But obviously Burano can shoot it up to 8K. So this is on the same scale now. So this is, it's not quite the same scale, actually something's happened with the scaling. But this is 4K, this is 8K. Burano shoots 8K XOCN LT, 1.5 gigabits per second. And if we look at 8K ProRes 422, you'll see it's a third of the size of what ProRes would be. And that's just ProRes 422. If you wanted to do 4.4... Yes, you're right, half the size. Half the size and a third of the size of the 444 and the higher quality ones. If we compare XOCN LT with ProRes 444 XQ in 4K, it's slightly smaller. The XOCN. It is an incredibly efficient codec. And in fact, even if you look at ProRes 422, 754 megabits per second in 4K, so that's your normal run-of-the-mill 4K ProRes, it is only twice the size. It's double the size. But you have to remember that's double the size. You're getting a 16-bit codec and in 8K. So it's not silly in terms of file size. It is bigger. You do need to take that into account, but it's not ridiculous. And XOCN was always developed to be very post-production friendly and computer friendly. So it uses a variety of compression methods. The main one it uses is something called wavelet compression. Now most codecs, H.264, H.265, XAVCI, use a compression scheme called DCT. And we're probably quite used to seeing compression artifacts in DCT codecs. And that's either going to be something called mosquito noise, which is like a fluttering in textures. So maybe you have the sky, and if you look very closely, if it's been very highly compressed, you might see some fluttering in that. That's called mosquito noise. And around edges, very sharp edges, you might see an artifact called ringing, which is where the edge seems to repeat a few times and slowly disappear. So those artifacts are quite common in very highly compressed DCT codecs. It's quite a normal thing to see those artifacts. The artifact that wavelet compression gives you, because of the way it works in an entirely different way, is as you compress the image more and more and more, you have fewer and fewer very fine details. Keep compressing it even more and you start to lose some of the less fine details. But it's also variable across the frame, so the whole frame isn't compressed the same. The codec will compress very finely details less, so you retain them, and then compress your bigger, blockier areas of the image more highly because there aren't the fine details there. So the compression artifact that you get with a wavelet codec is basically a reduction in sharpness. And the beauty of that as an artifact is nobody notices, because you can't actually see it as a compression artifact. The only time you'll ever really see wavelet artifacts is if you are able to compare the original file or the uncompressed image with the compressed image and look at both in great detail, and you might, and I really do use the word might, be able to see some loss of textures in certain parts of the image if you're comparing like by like. But that loss of textures to a viewer that hasn't seen the original file just looks like there's perhaps not much detail there. Doesn't look bad in any way, shape or form. So a lot of people in social media sort of said, oh God, I wish Burano had XOCN ST and XT. I suspect they've never actually used those codecs, because if you look and compare XT and LT, most of the time you won't be able to tell which is which. When you look at the footage, you can't. I've done this in many workshops, and I've put both XT and LT up side by side, shot with a Venice, which can do both, and you can't tell. You just cannot tell which is which. And a lot of high-end productions now are actually deliberately choosing to shoot on LT with Venice simply because they can't tell the difference. The audience certainly won't ever tell the difference, and you can save a huge amount of storage and data space, especially if you're doing a shoot in a remote location and things like that. And if we compare XOCN LT, 1 hour of 8K from a Venice, 780 gigabytes, compare that to an hour of ProRes 444, it's the same size, and that's 4K. And if we compare it to ARRI RAW at 4.5K, it's going to be 1.6 gigabytes for 4K compared to 0.78 terabytes compared to 1.6 terabytes. So it's a lot smaller than ARRI RAW. And it's, I can tell you right now, it's also a lot easier to handle in post-production. So I'm just going to go into DaVinci Resolve here. So this is DaVinci Resolve, and these are some of the XOCN clips that I shot in Norway. And let me just have a look at how my project's set up, because I haven't fiddled around with this. So let's change the timeline resolution to 8K. So we'll do this in DCI 8K. So we're working in 8K. These are 8K clips. If I go to the metadata here, you will see this is 8.6K by 4.5K. And I can just hit play. And the clips play back in real time. Playing back 24 frames per second, 23,976 with green light there. So this is on a laptop. Working with this stuff is easy. And in fact, compared to the XAVC HI, the new codec, I find the XOCN much easier to work with. Wavelet compression is very easy to decompress. It's very computer friendly. So all of this stuff that I'm shooting in 8K and doing in 8K now, I do still have a workstation at home, but I'm using my laptop more and more. And I use my laptop to do most of my work now because I'm traveling, I'm on the road a lot. And I'm just transferring the footage from the CF Express cards to just off-the-shelf SSDs and editing and working in 8K directly off those. It's easy. It's not something to be afraid of. Now, if you do have a less powerful computer, there are things that you can do. If you're using DaVinci Resolve, if I go to the camera raw settings and I go to Sony RAW here, at the moment, I'm not sure if you can read that, that says full resolution resolve. So we're working in the full resolution of the file. But if I am using a less powerful computer, or I really do need an extremely fluid workflow, I can drop this to half or quarter resolution. And because of the way the files are compressed, within the actual file, there are half resolution and quarter resolution frames. So the software doesn't actually have to create a new frame. They actually exist in the compressed recording. The compressed recording, if you can actually see the frames that are recorded, they're broken up into half, which is actually, if you think it's a Bayer sensor, that's all the green pixels. And then you have two little windows, which will be your red and the blue. And they also then have a quarter and a half, a quarter and an eighth resolution version as well. And so the software hasn't got to decode a new file. It's already there in your recordings, that data. So the files then actually behave like HD files. And that will give you very smooth, very fluid playback, even on a very modest system. This is a MacBook Pro M1. It's not maxed out. It's 32 gigs of RAM. I think ideally I'd like to have the 64 gig one next time, but I have no problems working with XOCN. Then because it is a RAW format, at the moment I've just dropped it into a standard timeline, standard project. So the footage is decoded by default as S-Log3. I prefer to work in a color managed workflow. So I'm going to go into my color settings and I'm going to use ACES. ACES is the Academy color encoding system from the Academy of Motion Pictures in the US, and the whole idea behind ACES is to provide a unified color grading platform for every camera that's made. So the Academy collects information from the camera manufacturers about the way the sensor works, about the color science, and then they use that so that when you shoot with a Sony camera, it is transformed into ACES color science. You shoot with a red camera, it's transformed into ACES color science. You shoot with a Panasonic camera, it's transformed to ACES. So every camera grades the same way. So if you've got a grade that you use with a Venice, it will work on an FX3. If you've got a grade that you use with a red camera, it will also work on the Sony cameras. You can use the same grade. So that allows you to mix and match different cameras within a production very easily. They can use the same lookup tables, the same grades, the same everything. And it really makes post-production simpler. The one thing that ACES, for some people this might be a small negative, is it tries to emulate film. So ACES always applies a film look, and this is part of the output transform that we have, or the ACES version. And depending on the looks that we want, if you change this ACES version, you get slightly different highlight roll-offs. They're film-based highlight roll-offs. So all I need to do to make this work for ACES, I don't have to tell ACES what camera this was shot on. So I leave this as no input transform because it's raw. Whenever you use raw, you leave this as no input transform. And I just have to tell ACES how I want this to be viewed or how I'm going to output this. And as this projector is Rec 709, we're going to do Rec 709. If I was doing this for an HDR monitor, I could choose some of my different HDR options. So we click on Rec 709, click Save, and now we have Rec 709. Or we could have HDR, or whatever we're outputting. And if you do, bring this up full screen. If you were to compare this, okay, interesting scaling thing going on here. Normally it would be full screen. If you compare this to the video that I showed you on the TV, it's actually not that different. There is very, very little grading that goes on in that edit that I showed you. So it makes all of this very simple, very easy, and whatever your workflow, HDR or SDR, it works. If I was to grade this and then I wanted an HDR version, the only thing I'd have to actually do is, in my ACES settings, is just change the output transform from 709 to one of the HDR options, something like this one perhaps, P3 ST284, and it would output in HDR with the same grade applied, and it would look fabulous in most cases. I wouldn't need to do anything else. That's it. I have an SDR version and an HDR version. So it's very simple. So I like these color managed workflows. Now, because this is raw, if I go into my color room here and I go to the camera settings down here, the raw settings, I can go from project to clip. Now when I go to clip, my metadata that I shot with is exposed. So my color temperature was just under 5.8K, no tint, 800 ISO, and then you have the default settings for sharpness, highlight, shadows, and everything else. Well, we can go in and we can change this. So if I felt maybe this was a little bit overexposed, I can bring the, oops, not that far. I can bring the exposure down. Perhaps actually overall I want the exposure to come up, so I've just raised the exposure, but I just want to bring the highlights down. And I can do that. And then another setting that we've got here, this is the mid-tone detail setting. So whenever you convert from the sensor output to your final viewing image, there will always be some sharpening going on. If you think about how a Bayer sensor works for a moment, we've got those red, green, and blue pixels, that pattern. But we have to make up information where we don't have it. So where there's a green pixel, we don't actually have any red. So we have to look at the nearest red, and we might look at 2 reds that are here and take the average of those 2 reds to fill in this gap here. And so that's one process. But whenever the debayering algorithm detects an edge, it will say, if it sees something as an edge, it says, well, if that edge was red here, it's probably red here, and we'll fill in red all along that edge. And we might just sharpen it a little bit because we don't have that much information, because if it's green, we'd have more information. If it's blue, we have less. So there's some sharpening that is added. And we have the ability to actually control that with this software, with the raw controls. So we can make it sharper. I'm not sure how it's going to look, so that looks probably over sharpened. And we can make it softer. Yeah, you can see the edges have gone. So we can change how sharp the image is. And I don't think you're going to see it on this screen. We have something called midtone detail, which is the contrast in midtones. So this is a little bit like sharpening, but it's very much more subtle, and it only tends to happen on midtones. So generally that tends to affect how your skin tones look. So you can adjust your skin tones to make them clearer or softer. If you're shooting with a beauty commercial, something like a fashion shoot, you might turn that down so you have softer skin tones, a softer overall look. If you're shooting something a bit more technical, architecture, something like that, you might bring that up a little bit to make the image look a little bit crisper. So you have a lot more control over the image when you shoot with RAW and you shoot with XOCN. And that's one of the really nice things about it, yeah.
What would be the difference between sharpness in the camera RAWs or adding sharpness like
so the difference is when we do it at this stage, you're actually affecting that conversion from that Bayer pattern to a color image. And there's lots of processing that goes on in that. There's I think a lot of people perhaps misunderstand how cameras work, in that with single chip cameras, when you convert in the camera in an FX6, for an example, because we've got this color pattern, there's a lot of information that's missing or is calculated based on the nearest values. So you don't just calculate the nearest values, though, to get a really good image. You're also going to sharpen a little bit, because where you don't have texture, you might want to bring that sharpness up a little bit, to fake it, for want of a better word, to try and make the red and the blue information look as sharp as the green. We have twice as much green information as we do red and blue. So if we want a balanced image, we might need to add a little bit of sharpening to the red and blue to kind of match it to the green. So there's a lot of processing that takes place between what the sensor outputs and what you record, of which this is part of that. But instead of doing it in the camera, we're now doing it in post-production. So we're doing all of this, we're actually controlling that process of converting from Bayer to a color image at that point as part of that process. Now, if you were to add too much sharpness here, you can't take it out later. Once it's there, you can't take it out. And this is perhaps one of the downsides when you don't have RAW, is actually you can't remove or reduce the sharpening that will be added. And you can't, even if there was a sharpen, there are detail controls in this camera, but that doesn't affect this part of the process. That is after that stage. So this is this is kind of one of the cool things about RAW, is that we can change this before it happens. And the other thing to consider is also when we compress something, there's also image processing there. With the DCT codec, with the types of codecs that you have in the cinema line, FX6, FX3, all of those cameras, that compression includes noise reduction, because noise is the enemy of compression. Because as far as a codec is concerned, noise is just detail in the picture. It's just extra picture information to compress, because it's different in every frame. So one of the processes that happens as part of an encoder is to noise reduce the picture first, to try and get rid of that noise, so that the codec is only compressing the desirable image information, not wasting data on noise. So almost every codec includes a noise reduction path. And that's one of the things that you see, actually, if you compare RAW with a compressed codec. RAW will almost always look more noisy because generally we're using a 16-bit codec. RAW is 3 times more efficient than conventional encoding. So with RAW, we're taking that one image off the sensor, 8K by 3 and a bit K, and we compress that. It's a single set of information. If we were to convert that 8K into a traditional color image, there would be a red, green, and blue, or Y, CB, and CR3 components. So instead of just being a single image, it's now 3 images, each of 8K, that we have to compress. It's 3 times bigger. RAW is 1/3 of the size, so it's inherently much more efficient. So we don't need to use as much compression to get a small size. So we don't need to have as much noise reduction to get that efficiency. The more you compress, XAVC is very highly compressed, we have to use more noise reduction in the codec itself to make that codec efficient. And that's not something you can turn off. Even though in the FX6 there is a setting where you can turn off the noise reduction, the codec itself still includes noise reduction. And you can't ever turn that off. Yeah.
So you can change the detail in the setting, but if I remember correctly, if I'm not mistaken, Sony added the option to do camera raw controls on Resolve, but it's still not raw. You can go change the metadata, so to say.
Yes.
Change the camera raw, but you're not actually changing this. So like, I'm just curious to know, what are you actually doing? Because I think you can go and change meat on detail, but it's
yes.
not raw, so you're not actually changing that.
No. So with the compressed codecs now, with the MXF XAVC files, you can bring them into Resolve. You have these same settings, but you're working on the compressed data. So it's already been compressed. So a lot of this stuff is already actually baked into the recording. Now, okay, prepare for a deep dive into technical stuff. Hold your nose and hang on for a minute. There is a lot of perception around RAW that is incorrect. RAW isn't a magic bullet. RAW, absolutely, if I can have a 16-bit RAW recording over a 10-bit compressed recording, absolutely, I'll take that every single day. But RAW doesn't perform miracles. You are still recording an image. That Bayer pattern of red, green, and blue pixels actually is still a picture. It's not, we often refer to it as recording the sensor data, which makes it sound like something fantastic and glorious, but actually it's still a picture. It just hasn't been converted into a normal RGB image that we're used to seeing, but it's actually still a picture. And if you can view a raw image directly, you will see, you'll know exactly what was shot with that camera. It's still an image. It's still what's called a bitmap. Now, when we record with a compressed recording, we take that raw bitmap and we convert it into 3 bitmaps, one of red, one of green, one of blue, or one of luminance, Y, one of CB, component blue, component red. So we have 3 images, 3 bitmaps. It's that conversion from 1 bitmap to 3 that makes raw that makes compressed recording very inefficient compared to raw. But if you think about it, is there actually that much difference between what we have with the raw image, which is 1 bitmap containing pixels that are red, green, or blue, or when we convert that 1 bitmap into 3 bitmaps, one of red, one of green, one of blue? Actually, there isn't. You've just rearranged the data and made it bigger. The same data exists in that component recording as in the raw recording. It's not actually different. It's just less efficient. So far, so good? It's the same data, same sensor. We've just taken it from 1 image where it's RGB, all on 1 plane, to 3 RGB, G, and B. But it's the same picture information. It's not different. So at this stage, if all we do is convert the Bayer image to an RG and a B image, you can grade and do exactly the same with either. There is not a difference. So I will say, well, hang on a minute. You can change the white balance of your raw. No, you can't. You cannot go back and change what was captured. That Bayer image will have had a white balance at the time you captured it, depending on the sensor settings or the way the camera was set up. And if all you do is simply convert that to one image that's RG and B to RG and B, they both have exactly the same color, temperature, and white balance information. It's not different. So what is different? Same with ISO. The ISO of that raw image is baked in at the time you recorded it. The camera doesn't capture every ISO all at once, it just captures at one. So what is it that is special about RAW? And the big thing is efficiency. The RG and B image is 3 times bigger. And that's going to require a lot more compression to make it small compared to something that's already a third of the size. So what tends to happen in practice is we have to use a lot more compression. And to make the file a manageable size, we use a shallower bit depth. So in RAW, that very small file, it's very common to use either 12-bit log or 16-bit linear. But if you tried to do 12-bit log or 16-bit linear with R, G, and B, the file size would be unmanageable. So we use 10-bit instead. So we have fewer tonal values. And the fact that we have fewer tonal values means that when we grade it, it might not grade quite as well as a 16-bit or 12-bit file would. That's the difference between RAW and RGB or component. Efficiency. That's it. So now we have the ability to go into Resolve and bring our S-Log3 XAVC in here, and we have these same controls. Why is this important? Well, the thing is, that the other thing about RAW that actually I've missed is when we record RAW, there is a ton of metadata that goes with that describes how the camera was set up. And we also, with RAW, because we can't view it directly, you must process it. So your software absolutely 100% has to know what you shot it with and how that file is structured. Because the software then knows what you shot it with, how the camera was set up, and exactly how that file is structured. When you make changes with these controls with the RAW, it's processed in a way that will mimic an ISO change or a white balance change. It will look like you've actually changed the white balance or you've actually changed the ISO because you know exactly how it was recorded. Yeah? And that's what RAW brings you. You know exactly how it was recorded thanks to the metadata. Because it's RAW, it has to be processed, so your software must understand the file exactly, perfectly, correctly. And then as a result, when we make these changes, it really looks like you're changing the white balance, or it looks like you're changing the ISO. All you're actually doing is adding gain, or effectively grading the footage in a way that resembles changing the white balance. And that's different to if you take your S-Log3 into an ordinary editing software and you try and change the white balance, it goes all over the place because your editing software doesn't know exactly how it was shot, doesn't know exactly which camera you used or anything else, so it doesn't know exactly how to modify the footage to make that look like a white balance change. But in a RAW workflow, because of the metadata, because of everything else, it knows exactly how that footage was recorded. Yeah, so far? Well, we bring our S-Log3 XAVC into Resolve now, and all that same metadata is there. The XAVC MXF files have all the metadata about which camera you shot it on, how the camera was set up, and because it's now properly recognized in Resolve, it knows exactly how to manipulate the S-Log3 curve to mimic an ISO change or a white balance change. So exactly the same things can happen with S-Log3. And if we think about it, because there is essentially no difference between that raw file and the RG and B or component file, you can make the same changes and it's just as flexible. The only difference is one is 16-bit and the other is 10-bit. And that will make a minor difference. So there is a lot of myth and magic around RAW, a lot of which isn't correct. And a component recording can be just as flexible. If that component recording was 16-bit and had the same compression as the RAW, it would not look different, it would not behave differently, even if it was encoded with S-Log, because the same data is there. Gamma curves like S-Log3, they're completely mathematically reversible. These are just mathematical sums that are added to the original footage. And if we know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, well, we know if we've got 4 and we divide it by 2, we'll be back to 2 again. Mathematics is reversible. So the only thing that you do get is differences in the compression, because the more you compress it, the more the mathematics gets a little bit distorted. So you might not always be able to return to what the original value was, because the compression might have given up some of the accuracy of the mathematics. So RAW, absolutely, 16-bit XOCN. Please, please, please give me 16-bit XOCN. It's lovely to work with. But it doesn't mean that you can't make amazing and incredible images with 10-bit S-Log3, because you can. Now, I don't know whether I should go into this. It's a little bit controversial. I want to. Let me see if I've got the files. No, let me just see if I should have the still images. So taking this to the next level, where did I put them? Maybe I don't have them. Maybe that's a lucky escape. So I did a workshop in Dubai. No, it's just the cache. There we go. Okay, so these are some frame grabs. So I was asked to do a workshop in Dubai to compare Arri Alexa LF against Venice, Burano, and some other Sony cameras. Because in Dubai, Arri are king because they're still basically mostly using the original Arri Alexas, and they don't want to spend money on new cameras. And everyone goes, well, no, why would we want a Sony? The dynamic range of the Sonys is not as good as the Arris. Yeah, I will agree with that statement, that Arri probably have a very slight dynamic range advantage over Sony, generally speaking. They have a little bit more highlight range than Sony have. Maybe that much. Even with the new Arri 35, it's well documented that the Arri 35 has more dynamic range than any other cinema camera on the market today. I would be lying if I said otherwise. Does it make a difference? No, because we already have more dynamic range than most people would ever need. So you're just giving more of something we don't actually need because we've already got plenty. It can make a difference in certain circumstances, but there are problems with it. So let's have a look at some still images. Let me just try and think of the best way to present this to you. What have I got? What's this one here? Let's have a look at this. Yeah, okay. Two cameras, side by side. Can you tell? I'm not expecting you to be able to tell me which camera is which, but can you even spot any differences between them? Yeah? There are differences. There's a difference on the highlight here on her nose, and a few other differences. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to which of those two was the more expensive camera, F or E? Who thinks F is the more expensive camera? Nobody wants to vote on this. Who thinks E is the more expensive camera? Wrong. Ding, 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 ding. E, I've got to make sure I get this right. The F is the LF, and the E is an FX3. Now, what do we see in these images? And this is actually it's quite interesting. This is the image that's come up. So this is raw, right? So it's noisier, it's grainier. This is compressed, so you've lost some of that noise and grain because of the compression. So that's what you're seeing, the difference between the compressed and less compressed. Now, one of the things that we did notice is actually shadows. There's not much shadow information here compared to here, which is interesting because this one should have more dynamic range. When it does, but it's all in the highlights. The FX3 goes deeper into the shadows. And that's a €4,000 camera versus a €70,000 camera. But the thing is, an audience looking at these, if they saw the film shot with this camera and they saw the film another day shot with this camera, they probably wouldn't notice any difference. And this is ACES. So this is an ACES workflow again. And the whole point of ACES is to make every camera look the same. So this is what ACES does for you, is it kind of levels the playing field a little bit because it actually removes a lot of the color science. We've got another. Here we go. I haven't labeled this one. Let's see if I can figure out for myself which one is which. Anybody care to guess which is which? I'm not even sure which is which. One of them will be, in fact, actually I know one of those is the LF and the other one is Burano. No, the bottom one's the LF. And the only reason I know that is I remember the framing slightly different on the LF because we had to take the camera off the tripod to swap lenses and a few other things, so the framing changed. And that's the only reason even I can remember which of those is which, to be honest. And this really is illustrative of actually where we are now with cameras and camera technology, is that there aren't any bad ones out there right now. No manufacturer is making a bad camera, particularly. They are all very, very good. And in terms of dynamic range, there are very few differences. What you probably can see is actually that the highlights here are probably just fractionally better than they are with the Burano. And that's the ARRI highlight range doing its thing. But you actually see more detail in the deep, deep shadows here than you do in here. Slightly different contrast. But it's very hard to tell which camera is which when you have a properly sorted workflow. And it's worth remembering that what we're looking at here is the difference between a raw workflow where the files are 1.5 gigabits per second and yeah, I think in this one, yeah, I know which is which. And in this case, one of these is raw 16-bit and the other one is 10-bit S-Log3 XAVC. You can see that you have more noise in this one than this one. This is more compressed, less noise. This is less compressed, more noise. But that noise does also equate to fine textures and details. And you actually see there's more fine textures and details in his beard than there is here. And that's a Sony A1 versus Venice 2. So it's interesting. And let's go a little bit further. So okay, so what happened in the workshop was everyone said, hang on a minute, yeah, but that's fine, that's just a basic grade. We all know that if you take raw into post-production and grade the hell out of it, it's going to hold up a lot better than XAVC. Okay, is that really the case? We found it very difficult. I just need to find the right images. Oh, no, come back. Where's my, what I called pink? Okay. So what we did, I'm going to start with the ARRI LF. So this is 16-bit raw, is we picked a single tone or a very narrow range of tones and turned them pink. The idea being to show the separation and isolation that you get between different tonal values, because that's what counts when you're grading, and also how fine those differences are. So the important thing that we're looking for is actually where you've got these areas where it's broken up, is you actually want that breakup to be as fine as possible, because that is an indication of very fine textural differences. So on his face here, the finer this breaks up, the better, because that's going to allow you in the grade to pick that individual hue and do something with it. If it's blocky, it makes it very difficult to grade. So this is the 12-bit log raw from an ARRI LF. Now let me see if I can find the FX3 with the same thing done. Right. Now you see your compression artifacts. See how this, you've lost those little fine grains of texture, and now you have almost like square boxes. That's the DCT compression artifact that you get with a highly compressed codec. We've lost the little round dots of texture, and they've been replaced with square blocks of groups of similar colors. And this is where you potentially would have a problem with your grading when you really push this. You can see it here in particular. You can see it on his face that these are now not, you can see it's square boxes. They're called macro blocks. 10-bit codec versus 12-bit log raw. Sure, there's a difference. Is it night and day though? It's not. It really isn't. Now let's have a look at something else. Let's now go to Venice. Or let's go to Burano, because that's the camera we're talking about. We did the same thing with Burano. Now with the Burano raw, we're back to these very fine spots rather than blocks. So this will grade much better than the XAVC from the FX3. It will. And we have much more subtle tonal differences. We don't see this. This was breaking up on the FX3. It's not here. On his hand, this pink looks more like a texture than an artifact. So this is going to grade much better because we're better separating the colors. What we did discover, looking at this, was having the higher resolution trumped the extra dynamic range of the ARRI. So this is 8K with the Sony cameras versus the 4K, because these textures are finer and even smaller when your resolution is 8K than if your resolution's only 4K. And what we found in post-production is we could push the Venice and the Burano footage further than we could the ARRI footage because of the extra resolution. It made a visible difference in how much we could grade. And also it made a difference to the way highlights behaved when we graded highlights. Because if you've got greater resolution and you can separate an overexposed highlight from the non-overexposed areas, you can do more with them in post-production. And the edge of that highlight, how that edge roll-off occurs, at a higher resolution camera, it tends to be smoother and more gradual than on a lower resolution camera. So the way you go into areas of overexposure looks nicer on the high resolution cameras than the low resolution cameras. And I think there's another example. One other. So we did a couple of different grades. Yeah, so let's have a look. So this is the FX3. Lifted the shadows to see what's in the shadows. And this is where you start to see the codec and the compression artifacts. There's all sorts of blocks going on in here and splotches of color. That's high compression doing its ugly thing. If we do the same lift with the Burano, look how much nicer that is. We've got the extra resolution because this is a crop. But instead of having these blocks, there is still some compression stuff going on, some noise going on here, but it just generally looks nicer. Then we do the same with the ARRI. And of the 3 images I've just shown you, this doesn't actually look all that different to the FX3. We've lost the resolution, so our artifacts are bigger and they're more blocky. There is a hell of a lot of color noise in the shadows of the ARRI camera. And that's a lack of chroma resolution because it's only a 4K sensor, so our chroma resolution is only HD because of the way the pixel pattern works. So we have a lot more chroma noise in the shadows. There's a lot of chroma noise here. We've got lots of these blue splotches in particular in here. There's lots of blue artifacts going through here. There are also color artifacts through here. These are actually color artifacts. It's not actually those colors. That band, those should just be white highlights. If I show you the Burano again, see how those those colors that are in there have gone, they're white. That's a lack of chroma resolution from the ARRI LF sensor because it's only a 4K sensor. Whereas the Burano 8K sensor, when we're downscaling to 4K, has full RGB sampling, and it makes a difference. So it's really interesting where we're going with sensors right now, is that resolution makes up for a lack of can make up for a lack of dynamic range, and it can also help overcome encoding issues. So I wasn't initially sold on 4K. I just wasn't. Sorry, on 8K as a sensor. So why do I want 8K? I'm completely sold on it now. That difference in the way these highlights behave between a 4K and an 8K sensor is quite staggering. And these all went through exactly the same workflow. We tried to make this as fair as possible. And those all come up with these different colors. And it's going to simply be that there wasn't enough green or red samples at this point. So it's trying to guess what that should be, what that highlight should be, and it's made it colored instead of just white. So I'm an enormous fan now of shooting at 8K or with an 8K sensor, downsampling that for my 4K deliverable, because it took me a while to actually identify it. But the very first time I used the 8K Venice, I was just looking at my footage and thinking, wow, this is nice. But I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't, say, this is nice. Oh, it's because X, Y, Z. It was really difficult to come up with that reason. It's one of those subtle differences. But it's things like this color accuracy and the increase in color sampling is what's making the difference, and why shooting with an 8K sensor makes a big difference. We went way off on a tangent there. I wasn't intending to go down that road. I was intending to talk about the FX series.
What if you shoot with
Oops.
FX3 and you have atoms and all that connected?
Yeah, so the FX3 is still only a 4K sensor. So you're not going to have color oversampling, things like that, but you will have a 12-bit log recording. It's 12-bit log raw. But you can't get it into Resolve easily.
But is it only a 10-bit out of the HDMI, isn't it?
No, it's not.
12-bit?
It is 12-bit, yes. Okay. Yeah, it actually comes out of the camera as 16-bit. But nobody has a recorder that can do 16-bit linear because it's unmanageable. So Atomos converted to 12-bit log, and it's recorded at 12-bit log raw. To be honest, it's on my to-do list is to actually take that footage into Resolve. Now, to get it into Resolve, I've got to convert it. And when you convert it, you lose a lot of your color space information. It's not quite the correct color space. Yes, you've got to convert it to DNG, but it's now in a bastardized color space. It's not S-log. It's not anything. So it's a little tricky to actually understand what it is that you've got in that material, because you can't compare it to the compressed recordings or anything else. To actually say, is this actually sufficiently better to make a difference? The testing that I have done suggests that if you, by the time you've done all these conversions and you've got it into Resolve, that actually it's not worth the effort. That I can push and pull the S-log3 as much as I can that raw file. But this is the thing with raw, is raw isn't magic. You can take S-log3, and especially now in Resolve that we have the access to these controls with the S-log3 MXF files, you can push and pull that S-log3 all over the place, and it doesn't fall apart. It actually holds up really well. Every time it surprises me, because I do know that if I take XAVC 4K and I find a really stressful scene and I shoot it, I can find artifacts in that footage. Not saying they're not there, they will be there, but they don't really, unless you're doing something completely weird with the footage, get suddenly much worse. And the audience certainly won't ever notice them on a normal size screen. So is it worth the effort of using an external recorder to record the ProRes RAW and then transfer that and convert that to a Cinema DNG to get it into Resolve? Now, if you are somebody that works in FCPX, then you can obviously take that RAW direct into FCPX, and maybe that works fine for you and that will work great for you. But I kind of want the control over my footage that I get in Resolve, the ability to add nodes, to be able to, all the latest stuff that I haven't even started exploring now, to take individual components and colors and grade them separately to other parts of the image, and to really get into the data in Resolve that you can't do in FCP. If you're serious about grading, which I kind of assume that if you're going to record in RAW, you must be, why else would you record in RAW? You want to use a grading package. You want to use grading software, not editing software. FCP is great for editing, but it sucks for grading. Resolve is pretty decent for editing now and is absolutely fantastic for grading. I mean, it's what the majority of your Hollywood movies are graded on now, is Resolve. And more of them are now being edited in Resolve as well, because it's a very simple, straightforward workflow. Yes?
Have you tried with the Blackmagic recorder?
I have, yes.
That can record in RAW?
Not from these cameras, it can't.
Okay.
So, and it's not RAW anyway. So, a lot of these cameras, RAW is not magic. Now we have these controls. It just simply isn't worth going through these extra steps half the time to do all of this stuff, because your end result isn't going to look any different. I for a very long time, taking an Atomos Ninja up to Norway so I could record in ProRes or ProRes RAW and doing all of this stuff, and I'd get back and I'd grade it, and then I'd bring in the XAVC and I'd do the same grade on it, and it looked the same. It's like, why did I bother with all of that? And I'm really critical about the way my footage looks, and I do know absolutely that if I was to let's simplify this a little bit and just say, let's take an FX6, record internally with XAVC and record externally with ProRes, not RAW, just the ProRes 422 or HQ, take it into Resolve. There will be fewer compression artifacts in that ProRes recording. There will be. Can I see them in the end result? I can't. Can my audience see them? They can't. Why bother? The perfectionist in me says, yes, you should always use the ProRes HQ because it is better. But I can't actually see the difference. So why am I bothering? Really, being pragmatic about it. Now, Burano is a different thing, because that internal 16-bit recording is what it does. That's how it works. That's what it delivers. I'm not using an external recorder. It goes directly into Resolve. All the metadata is there. All the conveniences are there. So absolutely, yes, I will take XOCN from this camera whenever I can, because that's what it's designed to do and that's how it works. But is it worth taking an FX3 or an FX6 and using an external recorder and going through hoops to try and get it into the best workflow that exists, and to use all that color management and everything else? No, I don't think it's worth it. You end up spending a lot of money on a monitor and other cards, and the end result is that your customer can't tell a difference. Yes?
What if you don't do RAW and you just do Cinetone or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that a beautiful big picture out of the Burano also?
Yeah, absolutely. You're still starting with that 8K sensor. So you'd have to use, to shoot Cinetone, you have to shoot with the 6K mode. The sensor's being read at 6K, but it's still oversampled. So you still have that benefit of increased chroma, and you still have the benefit of the very high dynamic range that Burano has, and all of those things. It's still a very nice image. Is the difference night and day between Burano and an FX? Let's go FX30 even. No, it's not. I would be lying if I said the difference was night and day, because the whole point of the Sony Cinema line is that they don't look different. From day one of the Cinema line, one of the key aims has been that whether you use an FX30, an FR7, FX6, FX9 or a Venice, that you should be able to cut between them in post-production and your audience not realize you're using different cameras. That's always been a key point of the Cinema line. There are differences. I'm not saying they're identical, because there are differences. And clearly a Venice 2 will produce a better image than an FX30. But it's not night and day. And it won't ever be night and day now, because we're at that point of diminishing returns with cameras, where the sensors and the codecs and everything else are getting better and better and better. So the improvements that can be made are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. If I was shooting a feature film, of course I would choose a Venice 2 with the 8.6K sensor, because the budget on the budget of a feature film, well, why wouldn't you? Because the cost of the camera is largely irrelevant. And when you've got a larger crew, then you perhaps want a bigger bodied camera to put all the junk that's mounted on a camera. I mean, my goodness, the amount of junk that goes on a camera these days. When we did Beetlejuice, so I shot the opening scene of the film, and you couldn't see the camera. There was so much stuff on it. There was the cine tape, which is like the horns for measuring distance. There was the controller for the Preston follow focus. There was a timecode box bringing timecode into the camera. There was an audio transmitter sending audio to the audio department. There was a wireless video link sending pictures to the video village wirelessly. There was a down converter on the box taking the 4K out to HD to feed monitors for one department, I don't know which. And then there was the 4K output coming from the camera as well. Then there was a power conversion block in between the camera and the battery, so we could hot swap to a block battery in between takes. It's like, where's the camera gone? It completely vanished under all of this stuff. Did any of that stuff improve the picture quality? Nope. Not one of those extra things made the pictures look better. They were all there for convenience. And that's important. You know, you've got, on a feature film like that, there is so much money at stake. I did try and do the maths, but it was something like, I figured it's roughly something in the region of $5,000 to $6,000 an hour shooting on that film. So you have something goes wrong with the camera, or something that maybe over the course of a day, and this was an interesting experiment, how much does it cost for the director of photography to have a coffee? So if the director of photography has to go and make a cup of coffee, brings it back, drinks it, say that takes 15 minutes, and he does that 4 times a day, that's $5,000. It is, because the production stops. That's why you have a runner and an assistant who brings him his coffee. this stuff, so on that level, you use a big camera and you add all the junk to it because it speeds up the rate that you can work at most of the time. If you're shooting a corporate video, you don't need all that stuff on the camera. You really don't. I see people, they buy their little FX3, lovely little lightweight portable camera. You can shoot high, you can shoot low, you can be really dynamic with it. And then they put a V-Lock battery on the back and they put their wireless transmitter on it. And before you know it, they've got their easy rig on and they're shooting everything from down here because the monitor's up here. So and all the back of their shots is sky. So they're now complaining, oh, there's no dynamic range on this camera. And it's like, well, if you shot a bit higher and looked down, it wouldn't be a problem. Sorry. But you have to think, which camera fits the job that you're doing. There is a point to where I'm going. The shoot in Norway, Burano was the perfect camera for that particular shoot. IBIS, XOCN, 16-bit for the grading, especially grading the Northern Lights footage. You have cache record, you have an intervalometer for time-lapse, you have slow shutter. You can go down to 64 frame shutter, so you can go, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, it's a 3.5 second exposure. You can do all of these things. That was really useful for the Northern Lights. You can put any lens on it. The IBIS really was worth its weight in gold on that shoot. The viewfinder. This viewfinder is as weird as hell. I'm not going to argue with anybody that says, huh? When they look at it, because there's some strange things about the ergonomics of it. It's a touch screen. So you're here operating your camera with your lovely touch screen. I don't get it. So you flip it up. Oh, I can't see the screen now. I've got to come around here to use the touch screen. Okay, right? I would love to have been in the office of the engineer that designed that to understand the logic in the thinking. It makes no sense. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because if you buy one, you'll probably realize the same. It'd be like, what was Sony thinking? But actually, out in the field, using it like that as a monocular viewfinder, it's actually really good. It's a nice, clear, crisp image that you can see at any light level. Again, in Norway, with all that ambient light, that bright ambient light, that was an absolute wonderful viewfinder to use. If I had tried to use it just as an LCD and touchscreen in that bright light, I would have been guessing. It's like, I can't actually see a picture because of the ambient light level. I couldn't see my phone either. So it's a bit strange, but actually it's highly usable. And it's actually much nicer viewfinder than the FX9 viewfinder. The optics in this are a huge improvement over what's in the FX9. My understanding is the mirror allows them to have optically a very long distance between the magnifier and the screen, and that changes or reduces the distortions in the optics, and that allows you to have this clearer, better image. I don't know, perhaps. They could have just made it a bit longer. But it does actually work, and it is quite usable. I don't know if you've seen, I had a hand in the Bright Tangerine accessories for this, and what we did for that is we've made it so the viewfinder mounts that way. We used the same optics in a housing, and the housing has a flap in the bottom, so you can put your finger in and touch the screen. So you can use the touch screen and the monocular viewfinder at the same time. I don't quite understand why Sony didn't do that or why nobody else has done that, because it seems a really logical thing to do. But that's €200, that adapter. It's not going to break the bank. Overall, as a package, I think Burano is fabulous. But what Burano is not is a mini Venice. It is a different sensor. It has different ND filters for different applications. You can't use the filters in Venice automatically to control your exposure. And that's a really nice thing when you're shooting interviews outside and the sun is coming and going, where normally perhaps you might have ridden the iris or changed the aperture to control the exposure. And then your depth of field goes during your interview. And you start then editing that interview and the background's going in, out, in, out, in, out of focus throughout the interview. It's jarring. use the auto ND or ride that variable ND filter, that doesn't happen. And in fact, it becomes very difficult to see those light changes, which is great because then you can edit that interview together and it's not jarring. It doesn't jump about. So Burano is great for those sorts of things. And it may well be, and I'm absolutely certain we will see Burano being used on high-end features when you need to put a camera on a gimbal or fly a camera on a drone. Because Venice is very heavy to fly on a drone. Burano is much lighter. If you're filming, there's a project I've been involved in recently, filming from boats, high-end feature film. With the IBIS and everything else, Burano is going to be fantastic for that. So it's a different camera to Venice, but it's also different from the FX9 and FX6. Where it differs over the FX9 and FX6 primarily is you have an 8K sensor, you have XOCN, 16-bit RAW. Much higher quality recording, much better image quality. FX6, FX3, FX9, and the rest of the cinema line, they're still fantastic cameras. They really are. And I wouldn't give up my FX30 just because I get a Sony Burano, because I would use my FX30 for certain things where I wouldn't use my Burano, because my FX30 lives in my laptop bag and travels everywhere with me. I didn't bring it on this particular job, but normally it does. You know, what am I going to film in? Why am I going to film you lot in a workshop? But you know, that FX30 goes everywhere and has allowed me to capture some really interesting things in very high quality. My FX6. I mean, it's a really good example, actually, if we want to take a case study. So Glastonbury Music Festival is coming up in June, not all that far away. Big event for me. We filmed that for the BBC and also for the festival. And last year, we used FX30, FX3, and FX6. And different cameras generally did different things. Now, the reel I showed you earlier was just the FX30, filming in the big top, and we use that, the benefits that 6K oversampling brings for really nice image quality, and we were using smaller lenses designed for Super 35 because it gave us the look that we wanted. One of the other camera guys is running around outside filming in the circus fields where there's lots of outdoor performers that are roaming around, and he took the FX3 with the 24-70 GM on it because reasonably fast lens. In the evenings, a lot of activities outside in the evenings, that 2.8 lens and the 12,800 ISO of that camera allowed him to carry on shooting at night. Very small, very portable, very lightweight. So covering that almost 2 square kilometers that the theatre and circus fields are was very easy for him. The camera has IBIS, so he didn't need to have a tripod to do most shots. If you pair that with a cine saddle, stick the cine saddle over your shoulders, look like a beanbag that will sit here. You can just sit the camera in the beanbag with that IBIS, get great stable shots. The beanbag weighs nothing. None of that gear weighs anything. Super portable, super flexible. The only thing it's missing really is the ND filter, so he used a dual polarizer variable ND on the front. And he loved shooting that way for that. Previously, he'd used FX9, and after 4 days of non-stop shooting, because these are late nights, because it doesn't shut down till 2 o'clock in the morning, and it kicks off again at 8 o'clock the following morning. We don't do that every night. He was physically exhausted. I was physically exhausted, but going to smaller, more portable cameras for the roaming camera was a huge, huge saving. And then the FX6, well, that was used again inside the big top, with the 28 to 135 millimeter lens for all the shots from the back of the big top and things like that on a tripod. And there we've got the built-in ND filter. You've got the 4K 120 frames per second, easily accessible in the camera, great autofocus, and that worked really well. So it's different cameras for different applications, different purposes. But because they're all Sony Cinema line, when we edit and cut it all together at the end, it all looks the same. Or at least same enough that the audience doesn't realize you've used multiple cameras. Makes my life so easy. It really does. And that is the strength of the cinema line, is that ability to pick the most appropriate camera for what you are doing. It won't always be the same camera. because it will depend on what you're doing. I shot Glastonbury with a Venice one year. Fuck. Never again. The footage, I have to say, even to this day, when every time I go there, everyone goes, have you got a Venice again this year? Because it looked fabulous. It's like, no, because it nearly killed me. Trying to lug a Venice around, we used Cook Anamorphics. They're not small. On your own, because you don't have an assistant on this job, because they're very limited with passes and everything else. So you're trying to lug that around. And I was absolutely paranoid because we're still sleeping in tents, the same as everybody else. I'm basically sleeping with the camera and the lenses, worried that someone's going to steal the gear overnight. And I just, no, not doing that again. I mean, we have big flight cases. Everything goes in big flight cases that are chained to these big things in the ground. So they'd have a job to steal anything. And we're in a secure compound. But even so, it's not something I enjoyed. So this is where the cinema line is great, is you have these options and choices. And the quality of all of them from the FX30 up is fabulous. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I mean, there's loads of 4K 120 from the FX30 in that video I showed you before, and it looks really great. So I'm going to be around for a bit longer. So if you do want to come and discuss anything, you have any more questions, please do come and ask. More than happy to answer them. I've probably overrun. Oh, not quite. Almost. He's keeping tabs on me. But I'll be around for a bit, and the cameras are here. That's the big thing. Let's be honest. If you're going to invest in a camera like, let's FX6, even FX9, Burano, why not hire one first? Find out if it's the camera for you. Try it. See what you think. Don't listen to all the crap that is on social media right now. I can make almost any camera in the world look bad if I do that with it. That's not how we shoot stuff. It isn't. So my recommendation is, if you're thinking about Burano, it's a fabulous camera. It produces a glorious, glorious picture. Is to hire it. Find out for yourself. Try it first. Compare it to your other cameras. You should immediately see the image quality differences. They're not night and day. They won't be, but they are there. They're real and they exist. And working with that XOCN, if you're somebody like me that self-shoots and does your own grading, it's wonderful. It's a lovely, lovely thing to work with. So, that's it.